Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is at least some idea as to how the sperm can carry genetic code that's not part of the standard DNA coding, that people have been forced to ration their insulin over the last 12 months given the state of finances in America, why penguins for some unusual reason abandon the first egg they lay, giant robots are closer than you might think, and images from NASA show a 12-year time-lapse of the sky that they can see. The first news we have for you is all about sperm, and specifically why it is that sperm can carry particular codes that aren't part of their DNA. The general position is that DNA is what it is. Those 4 nucleotides in whatever sequence they appear are what are and will be everything in DNA. More recent research has shown a variety of ways in which DNA can be regulated beyond just the nucleotides that make it up. For example, methylation can either turn on or turn off genes that are present. This allows an extra layer of control. Then you have things like long non-coding RNA that can shut down entire sequences and add yet another layer, but a much more flexible layer of control. One of the big elements that comes from this is how the non-nucleotide based DNA can be coded and passed on to the next generation based on what the individual has been exposed to throughout their lifetime. This is known as epigenetics, and that is genetic research or genetic findings that aren't related to the DNA itself, but other ways of managing DNA. And because it is relatively new, it is a very big thing, especially for sperm, since sperm will make up half of what anyone is before they're born. The specific research that we're directing to you this week relates to whether or not males have adequate folate. Normally, it's the prospective mother who has concerns about folate levels, but in this case, if the father does not have adequate folate levels, then histone, which is what DNA spools around when it's stored, is not made properly, and this is one of those things that can then affect the viability of a developing embryo. Even if the embryo were to be maintained, this can then lead to all sorts of developmental abnormalities, particularly spinal abnormalities. Going from genetics to instead hormones, and specifically looking at insulin. At least one study has recently found that more than 1 million Americans have been forced to ration their insulin over the past 12 months. The importance of insulin cannot be underestimated, especially for those with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is where the individual cannot make their own insulin, as the cells responsible have been destroyed, and there is no way to replace them at present. This means they need to substitute their insulin by getting it injected from an outside source. That is where insulin from some sort of pharmaceutical company comes into play. Injecting the insulin that they've purchased allows them to lower their blood glucose levels and lead an otherwise relatively normal life. Without this, their blood glucose levels would remain elevated, and there are all sorts of complications that can ultimately lead to death. In many countries, and at least those with universal healthcare, purchasing insulin is subsidized, and so there isn't any difficulty in an individual living with diabetes, specifically type 1 diabetes. In America, where this isn't the case, it's not true, and so this is one of the big reasons why people are rationing insulin. To no one's surprise, those without health insurance were the most common to have to ration it, and that being either skipping their insulin, not taking as much as they're supposed to, or delaying the purchasing of more insulin. Those under 65 did so than those who were over 65, and those who were older needed to worry less as they seemed to be covered by Medicare. There were also issues to do with socioeconomics and race. Going from medical news that's at least related directly to medicine to instead misinformation and social media. Specifically, a report on Facebook's activities, or at least Meta as a whole, and how it is the service of choice for delivering pseudoscience, misinformation, and more. The article goes into the interesting readings, and admittedly somewhat subjective readings, of the company blogs as to what they're doing about vaccines before COVID became a major topic on their platform. What the author basically claims is that the blog post admits that they're going to try and downplay the spread of misinformation, but that they're also choosing to host it. The two are not necessarily exclusive, but they are running at odds to each purpose. This is all based on a series of documents called the Facebook Papers, and it's 18 documents that basically have never been seen by the public, but they're internal Facebook information telling people what they were deciding and why they were deciding to do what they did, and all amongst high-level employees and some mid-level employees. It reveals a great deal of information about what Facebook knew, why Facebook decided to do what they did, and what implications they knew this would have. The article goes into further details on the purported knowledge of the various employees as to not only what they could do, but what they did or didn't do, then the implications that this had on things like COVID-19, but also the outbreak of measles in New York, and the spread of anti-vaxxer misinformation. The concerns here are that they then knowingly chose to do nothing about this. The problem with the article, as far as we're aware at this stage at least, is that there is certain information coming to light that the federal government in America may have actively directed them, in less strict terms, to prevent the spread of COVID-19 misinformation. And so there's certain problems with how the private company is operating their service, involvement of the government, and what isn't known from a very limited selection of documents. The article from Gizmodo goes on to provide a reasonable summary of some of the events and information in each of the documents, but as noted, this is a limited sample and it should be taken with some degree of skepticism, not only because they are released documents, but that the documents aren't complete with all the other surrounding information. Further to that, there are questions about the full story of what Facebook is doing and what they are and are not required to do as a private company. These are concerns, let's say, but you should be very cautious in how you take all the information. Next we have animal news and bizarre behaviours amongst particular penguin species, the erect-crested penguin, and how they abandon the first egg that they lay each season, noting that they only lay 2 eggs each season. This means the population can only ever increase by 1 per breeding pair each year, rather than 2. The behaviour itself is a relatively new observation, only being seen at the end of the 20th century in 1998. To figure out what was happening, they then had to look at data from the 50 years before then, and they found that yes, it is a consistent pattern. What the researchers think is happening is that because the penguins have to migrate a certain distance to get to their breeding grounds, the first egg is smaller than the second. Once the birds get to their breeding grounds, they are then able to lay a much larger egg. And this larger egg will not only produce bigger birds, but have a much better chance of survival. This is supported by evidence from back in 1998, where they attempted to keep the first eggs in the nest as well as the later second egg. What they found was that the first eggs did not have a very high survival rate, whereas the second egg did. This is what supports the theory that the first egg is likely abandoned because it's not got a very good chance of survival compared to the second. Skipping a short way from New Zealand across to Australia, and what can only be considered an unusual beach find. This is a smooth, pink, flesh-coloured thing that looks kind of like a tentacle. It washed up on a beach in Australia and has drawn a great deal of attention. The reason it's drawn attention, rather than just being a weird anomaly, was its size. This is a very large, giant pink structure. It is suspected to be the penis of a whale. That is not to say it isn't necessarily something else, but marine biologists accept that it does have a marked semblance to what you would expect to see. Going from animal news to robotic and technology related news, and something that really shouldn't surprise you. And it's an article from The Conversation talking about how killer robots are already here. If you have any familiarity with drones and the penchant of America to use them with a great deal of zeal, you won't be surprised that killer robots are already here. Reality is that America bombs at least one place a day, if not slightly more, with drone strikes. Drone strikes that are relatively autonomous. They do still require a person, let's say, to hit the button to deploy the weapon, but other than that, no, they are completely independent until they get back to base. It is true that we're certainly not at the level where we have something like the Terminator walking around trying to kill off the future's resistance leader, but we are at a point where there are certainly ways that technology is trying to get us. Over the last year or so, we've seen this play out in Ukraine, where Ukraine has made regular and very effective use of much smaller drones to take out Russian armoured vehicles, and they've shown extreme efficacy in this. Turkey has also gone to great lengths to not only make their own, sometimes with stolen technology, and is now looking at supplying these to Russia in turn to deal with Ukrainian armour. The article from The Conversation goes into more detail on not just the kinds of robots with weapons that are being developed, those that already exist, but also some of the response to them. For example, Elon Musk leading an effort to get many AI and robotic developers to call for weaponized robots to be regulated. Then you also have things like how can we safeguard, going into the future, what these robots will do. Consider the relative impunity with which America operates their fleet of killer drones. To end the week's news for you, a much more upbeat and certainly epic image. And it's a time lapse that NASA has taken of the entire sky over 12 years. That is the image of what you would see out into the universe. The time lapse of what the sky does over these 12 years is really something, and you can see how the universe around us has changed based on the images that are taken roughly once every 6 months. And that's what we see as we circle the sun. Things aren't necessarily constant, but what we see will change. What it changes and how it changes is really impressive, and something that NASA keeps publishing. This is not the first image, and nor will it be the last. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.